All right, hello everyone. Welcome to today's event. This is our June 2023 Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gumbert from MSDynamicsWorld.com. Really pleased to be able to welcome you all today. Just a couple notes as we get started here. First, we are recording today's event. We'll be making that available after the session ends. We'll send out an update with that information soon. We also welcome your questions during the event, so please look for the questions block, enter them at any time. I know Nick will be keeping an eye on that as he goes throughout the hour here. So I think that's all from me. Without any further delay, then I'll hand things off to our host, Nicholas Hiduk.
All right, so I'm just loading some things up here in the background because of course my computer had to restart overnight. So all the prep I did yesterday to have everything open was all for naught. Okay, welcome everyone. We are, I guess, now pretty much halfway through 2023. Today's topic, we're going to talk about Power Pages and FetchXML. So this is a bit of a we're going to see how FetchXML can be used in a kind of a variety of different places, some more kind of pro code stuff and some more in the low code area. So we will look at, I've kind of found 4 different places where FetchXML is useful, and we will go through that. We'll also maybe have a little bit of an extended news area where we go over what we kind of heard from MS Build, which is all new since the last time we gathered a month ago. So let's get started here. So if this is your first call, welcome. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I am the president and software engineer of Engineered Code Consulting Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been working with Power Pages, Power Apps Portals, all its incarnations over the last, I guess, probably 13 or 14 years now. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn or follow us on Twitter, please feel free to do so. I've got a blog that is actually active these days. We had a post out late last week, I believe, on the pricing of Power Pages. We've also got our YouTube channel where we release a roughly 2-minute tip every week, as well as a podcast that I co-host with George Dubinsky. We've got a couple episodes in the queue that should be released here in the next week or so. So all of those are available to you. Please feel free to connect with me on any of those social media channels if you want to. Okay, as I always like to do, I want to say thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for collaborating on these Portals community calls now for 3.5 years. It's a great collaboration, and Jason, the value that they provide with MS Dynamics World is awesome. So great to partner with a great company like that on these calls. Again, agenda, we'll go through the portal news. We'll talk about today's topic. We'll talk about the next Portals community call. And I think there'll be some time for Q&A as well. We'll see how the FetchXML stuff goes. It kind of depends on how many Q&As we get throughout the actual presentation itself. So let's talk about the Portals news. So most of these are from announcements that came out around the time of Microsoft Build. The big news was Copilot. If you haven't heard of Copilot and you're in the Microsoft space, I welcome you from your coma, because that's pretty much the only way you hadn't heard of Copilot before is if you've been living under a rock for the last few months. So Copilot. If you ever go to a Microsoft conference, that's probably the only word that you'll hear. And exciting news, Copilot is coming to Power Pages. So the use cases that I've seen, there's a few different use cases for it. One of it has to do with actually the text that appears on your Power Pages site. So you can use Copilot to help you essentially write the content on your Power Pages site, or if you have existing content, you can ask it to, rewrite it, whatever you want to do. So pretty kind of traditional, it's weird to say anything AI is traditional, but like the typical use cases with with AI, where you say, hey, here's a paragraph, make this more professional, less professional, more casual, or you give it an idea and say, hey, spit out a standard paragraph for an introduction to a website, and it can help you with that sort of thing. The next one is, so again, the text one is yes, it's in Power Pages. It's really, they've taken that interface and kind of just made it easy they've kind of moved it into Power Pages. But in terms of functionality, you could kind of already achieve that before with just by going to ChatGPT. Something that's very specific to Power Pages is having Copilot help you build a form. So you can tell Copilot, hey, I want to build a form that is a case management system. What it will do is it'll actually build you a table in Dataverse. You could add columns to it, and it will build out the form in Power Pages as well. This is a cool bit of functionality that demos really well. I would say, honestly, for the most part, I don't know if it's quite ready for prime time on real projects because of limitations, like it will always create a new table in Dataverse. So it's not very often that we're building something in Power Pages where the table doesn't already exist. So the Copilot's not really aware of what tables are there, so it's always going to be creating new tables for you. So I would say that right now it's more in the infancy stage, that particular functionality, but those are gaps that I expect to be addressed relatively quickly, and then it'll make its way to being used in more kind of production use cases soon. There's also a chat bot. So they've added functionality that with basically a click of, I think it's 1 or 2 check boxes, that you could add a chat bot to your Power Pages site. And what's cool about that is, in addition to it just kind of having the standard AI, it also will index the publicly available pages on your site. So for example, if you have a knowledge base that's publicly available on your Power Pages site, it will index all that content and include that knowledge as part of the chatbot. So a couple of clicks, it's going off, it's indexing, it's using Bing to index your portal, anything that's publicly available, and you can quickly get a chatbot that can answer questions that are very specific to your organization through what is exposed on the knowledge base or any other kind of publicly available content on your site. I know that there's more coming with Copilot. I think there's some stuff having to do with like images, and so yeah, I think you'll continue to see. Oh, thank you for the post here. Yeah, I hit pause way back at the beginning, so yes, you're not seeing the correct screen. There wasn't too much exciting on the other ones. It was just my standard things. But yes, thank you for pointing that out, because we were still stuck on the main screen and you weren't seeing this. Thank you, Shirley and Monica. Should be good now though, if someone can confirm, but you should see the stuff now.
It is. Yep, we see it.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, there was Copilot. Well, good. You didn't have any spoilers about what Copilot was because you didn't have the right slides. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, that was Copilot. Next I have here on the list is Power Automate. So Microsoft has announced, I believe it's in preview now, where you can invoke Power Automate Cloud Flows via the Power Pages web API. So the way that this works is that there's actually a special trigger in Power Automate that's specific to Power Pages. And so if you use one of those, if you use that trigger, you will be able to then call that Power Automate Cloudflow using the Power Pages web API. What's very interesting about that is that the call to the Cloudflow is actually synchronous. When we talk about Power Automate, usually one of the things that often comes up is, well, it's asynchronous. You don't know when it's going to finish. But the way that this has been implemented, the Cloudflow will actually run, and whatever the Cloudflow kind of responds with, you'll actually get back in your web API call. So you make a call to invoke the Cloudflow, and you will get a response once the Cloudflow has been run, and whatever output parameters have been configured in that Power Automate flow will be returned back to your Power Pages via the web API. So, so we're still not at the point where all the places we could run workflows, say in lists and forms, where we can use Power Automate. It's not there yet. I hope that's coming. But what we have right now is, again, it's invoked through the web API. So you have to write, essentially a line or two of JavaScript to invoke that. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think much of the work was about getting it to function, and now adding it to other places in the UI. Hopefully will be relatively straightforward now that the underlying plumbing with the custom trigger that's specific to Power Pages. I think hopefully once the foundational work is there now, it'll make adding that into more places a lot easier. So yeah, that was announced as being available in preview. The next one we have here on the list is virtual tables. So if you're not familiar with virtual tables, this is a concept in Dataverse where you create the metadata or the schema for a table in Power Page or in Dataverse, but the actual data itself is not stored in Dataverse. Instead, it comes from some other external data source. And the idea is that much of the functionality that's built in, let's say, a model-driven app where you can display lists and forms, because you've defined the schema, so because you have the name of the table, because you have the columns, the lists and the forms work. And so when that data is required, the underlying virtual table provider queries those external systems in real time. So probably the most classic use case is putting it at a SQL database. So you can have a SQL database with a specific table, and it to users looks like that table may exist in Dataverse because you've created a virtual table, so they can do advanced finds, they can view the records in views and forms and all that sort of stuff. But in reality, that table is consuming no storage in Dataverse, and every time the user refreshes the page, it's actually going over to SQL to get that data. So because that is a Dataverse capability, since Power Pages is built on Dataverse, those capabilities also extend to Power Pages. Now, I actually was requesting clarification from this from Microsoft because I always thought that virtual tables were supported, and the answer I believe was, I mean, they weren't not supported, but I would say like it wasn't that anyone was specifically testing to see, okay, how does this work with Power Pages? Are there certain providers that do or don't work? So what Microsoft is really doing now is they're essentially trying to go through and validate those providers and say, yeah, like if you use this provider, this is something that we fully support. So it was kind of before in this kind of gray area of like, it wasn't unsupported, but it wasn't necessarily supported. And now the effort's being put in to make sure that these things are supported. So at this point, I believe there are two virtual table data sources that are supported. I believe it's still preview, and that is the SQL scenario as well as SharePoint. So if you're using those virtual connectors for the virtual tables for SharePoint or for SQL, those are supported on Power Pages. And I believe the desire is that list is going to get longer and longer and longer over time, and so there'll be more virtual table providers, and that will be one way that you're starting to interact with data that exists outside of Dataverse on Power Pages. Because outside of virtual tables, if you want to access data that's outside of Dataverse, you're talking a lot of custom code. You're talking about a custom integration. Whereas with virtual tables, that can open up a whole new world of data that we can see within Power Pages. So those are, let me see, those are kind of the big ones, but there is more. So that's what I have on my list here is developer websites. So for those of us who are constantly playing around with Power Pages, doing different things, right now the idea of spinning up a trial and the trial going away every so often, it's kind of a pain in the you know what. So now we don't have to worry about that so much. There is a type of Power Pages site that you can turn on, which is a developer website. And these are, I believe, kind of tied to the developer environments that exist in Power Platform. So if you spin up a developer environment and you spin up Power Pages in that development environment, that Power Pages site will continue to live on in perpetuity. I believe as long as you access it at least once a month. They will kind of identify ones that are not being used and kind of disable those ones. But if you're using it all the time, I believe it will stay alive. I believe there are some limitations. I think the biggest one is I don't think you can take it out of private mode, so it has to remain in private mode. I can't remember if there's other limitations, but in terms of like real functionality, you know, it's all there. So it's a great way to play around with the platform, and you know, that's what I use. That's what I use as a developer environment for all of my kind of playing around, all my MVP activities when I'm doing presentations. I have a developer environment, and that's how I use things. So now I just don't have to worry about my trial disappearing every so often. Also on the list here is the ability to configure code components or PCF controls in the Design Studio. So that was previously required you to kind of jump over to Power Apps, so make.powerapps.com. Now I believe that's kind of in that in the data workspace when you're configuring your forms, you have the ability to configure code components. Another one here is web templates as components. So this is something where if you are building web templates, you can include what they're calling a manifest file. Let me just see if I have an example of that here. Code components. Of course, it was in my links that I had all set up earlier. That is Web API, FetchXML. Let me just grab that. There we go. Okay, so what you'll see is that you can actually include a manifest that at the beginning of your web template that says, you know, what type it is, what the display name is, the description, and essentially some parameters. So once you define that manifest, and then after that, all of your code follows it, it then becomes available in the Power Pages Design Studio. So you can see here we had title, reviews of interest, count 3. Those are based on these parameters. So users can start to add this component to the page and specify the parameters that they want for your particular component. So it kind of gives us the ability to kind of build little custom widgets in web templates that kind of the low code, no code authors can use. So this is a really cool bit of functionality as well. And then the final one I have on my list here is just the VS Code merge conflicts. There's been some work done by Microsoft so that if multiple people are working in VS Code and they both kind of click save at, you know, one person clicks save and then another person clicks save, it'll actually start prompting you and saying, hey, there's been a new update to the file since you last made the change. What do you want to do? Do you want to overwrite? Do you want to merge conflicts, that sort of thing? So there's been some investment on the kind of the pro code editor side as well. Okay, and that's kind of what the news was from MS Build. There was lots of news. I'm sure I missed one or two things, but going back through my notes, those were kind of the highlights. Again, the big thing is Copilot from Microsoft. I mean, it's not going to change any lives right now in the Power Pages space, but this is the first of what I expect to be many enhancements that we see in the Copilot space. All right, so just double checking, no questions. All right, so let's move on to today's featured topic, which is Power Pages and FetchXML. So let's start off by, I'm assuming most people know what Power Pages are, that's why they're here. So let's talk about FetchXML, because it's possible you've built Power Pages, or you've built a bunch of stuff on the Power Platform, and maybe you haven't run into FetchXML. So FetchXML is a proprietary XML-based query language for Dataverse. So with a SQL database, you got your SQL language. Now, technically, yes, you can write SQL against Dataverse now, but like the main kind of query language for Dataverse is FetchXML. That's the primary way that we interact or that we query and construct queries for Dataverse is FetchXML. So since for Dataverse, we're using FetchXML, Power Pages is built on top of Dataverse. That means that Power Pages also is kind of based on FetchXML. If you are new to FetchXML, as mentioned, it is an XML-based query language. So rather than writing like, a SQL query, you write out an XML-based statement that does the query for you. If you're new to this space, or even for those of us who have been doing it for quite a long time, we don't love writing XML by hand. We don't love the ability, having to remember exactly what properties are called. So my old friend Jonas Rapp has built what might possibly be the most popular tool for the XRM toolbox, called the FetchXML builder. So if I open up my XRM toolbox here, we'll see the tool here that Jonas has built. And essentially the idea is that it's a WYSIWYG kind of GUI for building out FetchXML queries. So in this case, we're saying I want the top 50 contacts. I want to grab the first name, and then I have a condition where the last name equals Hayduk. I can go in here, I can add additional conditions and filters and all that sort of stuff. I can also add link entities, which are essentially the equivalent to joins in SQL. And as I'm adding these conditions, I click the FetchXML and it's actually creating, this is the FetchXML query. So if I were to go in here, last name equals that, I could also go into here, I've got a drop down. Here's all the attributes I have on the contact table. So here I could say first name, got first name, then we have all the operators, equal, not equal to, so I can say not equal to John. And it also has lots of great features, like if I want to say it's equal to a lookup, it'll look up the records for me. I can do a link. So here I've got the attribute for first name. Let's just say I want to also include the parent account. So I could say parent account, link type, inner and outer. Then I can also include things from that particular join in my response as well. So I'm just going to delete that for now. I can then say execute. And then I can see the actual results here. The results coming back in this case in XML format. I believe you can also, there's a bunch of other capabilities in here to convert it to C# code, JavaScript, SQL query, that sort of thing. And I can also, if I want to, change how the view is, so I can change that so that it's, we've got the layout, and then there's also a bunch of options in here about how I want to show. So if I say results, I can say raw results. I can also have it show up in a view, XML, JSON, custom format, web API format, a bunch of options in this tool. So if you're building FetchXML or you're using FetchXML in Power Pages and you're doing it by hand, you're probably working way too hard. So strongly recommend that you check out this tool for the XRM toolbox. Okay, so where can we use FetchXML? I think I kind of mentioned earlier that there are 4 places I can think of. I wouldn't be surprised if I forgot about some, But the four that we're going to talk about today are, you can use FetchXML in Liquid, you can use FetchXML in the Web API, which I think maybe some people may not have realized. And then you can also use them. So those are kind of the more pro code side of things. I would say Liquid is maybe closer to low code. Web API is, I would say, closer to pro code. But in terms of like more configuration based, we also leverage FetchXML in both the list custom filters and in the list or form action button filters. So we'll go through all of those and we'll see kind of all the different places where if you already know FetchXML, you can use that on Power Pages. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is let's talk about how we use it in Liquid. So what I'm going to do is go back to here. So I'm going to go into my Design Studio. I'm going to create a new page. Now, if this is, again, the first time you're joining us, everything I do is generally related to golf. That's what I like to do outside of work. So all of my sample scenarios are related to golf. Now, I have a data model where I have golf courses. I often am displaying them in a list using the list capabilities of Power Pages. But let's pretend that I want to show them in some other kind of fancy format that I want to craft the HTML myself versus just kind of using some of the low code capabilities. So I'm going to call this golf course layout. We don't need to add it to the main page navigation. I'm going to just click add here. So this is going to take me to a new page here. And what I'm going to do is, when we're working with FetchXML and we're working with Liquid, it's often kind of easier to do it in more of a Visual Studio Code type interface. So that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to use the VS Code integration to edit my page. I haven't logged into this for a while, so I have to go through this process. But so here is the actual content I have on the page. And what I'm going to do is, not that one, just looking for my template tag. So the way that we leverage FetchXML in Liquid is through the FetchXML Liquid tag. So I'm going to copy and paste this FetchXML Liquid tag. Go back here, I'm going to paste it in here. And so this is where we would actually place our FetchXML. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to change my query here from contact to NH golf course. I'm going to delete. And what I'm going to do is, let's just say in my layout, I only want to show courses that are where the cost is over, say, $75. So I'm going to add a filter in here. So I'm going to look at the green fee, which is the price to play. And I'm going to say greater than or equal to $75. And then I'm going to choose which columns I want to return. So I'm going to select attributes, and let's just say I want to include the name, and let's just say the green fee for now. So this crafts my FetchXML. You can see it's telling me, and I'm going to get rid of the top 50 because I don't need that in my case. So we're doing a FetchXML query where we're saying, get me all the golf courses, get me the green fee and the name, and the filter condition is, oh, I'm going to get rid of that because I don't want to need that. And the filter condition is where the green fee is greater than 75. So I'm going to run this and see what it gets me. So we can see that it actually gives me back two results. We have Wascana Country Club and we've got Augusta National. So I'm going to go to my FetchXML and I'm going to copy this. Go back here, and that's what I'm going to paste in here. So I have my FetchXML tag. What it does is it wraps the actual FetchXML statement. And then what it does is it creates a variable, a FetchXML variable called result variable. So whatever I put in here, I can name this whatever I want. So I'll just call this golf course query. So after this statement, we can assume that that query has been run, and we could then output details about that query. Now, the actual results here, the actual result object contains a .results.entities to get the records and a bunch of different attributes. So maybe just for now, just as a quick proof of concept, we'll get the total record count. So results dot, actually, let's skip a step here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a loop. So in Liquid, we have the ability to do a for loop. And so what we're saying is for every entity, so for every row in the results, we're going to loop around and we're going to output something. So this thing right here is the actual golf course. So I'm just going to output nh_name. This is doing a table. I'm not so worried about a table at this point. Let's do it as a div. Go name, div. So we'll do that. So what I'd expect to see here is a number of divs for each result that we get back here, which I believe will be 2 because that's what we saw in the FetchXML. So I'm just going to move my little thing there. So I'm going to save this. So saving my file back there. Now I'm going to go back here. I'm going to tell it to sync. We'll see how bad my coding is on the first try. Look at that, so it's executed my FetchXML. I'm gonna have it load so you can see here, it's outputted that. If I go and I say view page source, you'll see that the FetchXML does not appear anywhere in the source because all Liquid is run server side and the results of the Liquid is returned to the user. The user never actually sees any Liquid code. So from there, I'm hoping you can kind of make the jump to, like, there's lots we could do here. We can craft relatively complex FetchXML queries that can do links and all that sort of stuff. And then once we have the data in Liquid, we could create all sorts of different templates here. So this is how, if you want them displayed in a card, if you want to show images, for example, you could have an image URL field on here. So maybe on the golf course, I would have a logo field. And then in here, I would do something like image source, and then this is where I do entity variable dot, nh_logo URL as an example. There's a whole lot you can do once you actually have the data that you've requested from Dataverse. Yeah, if you have any questions for me as I'm going through this, please do throw those in the question box. I don't see any there, so I will keep going. But yeah, essentially that at a high level, that's what we can do with, if you know FetchXML, you can essentially drop a FetchXML query on the page using Liquid and then grab the results in Liquid as well. The one thing I will note is that this, along with what we'll talk about next, which is a web API, both of these do enforce table permissions. So if you're running this code and you're not seeing any results back, even though you may have run that in the FetchXML builder, if you're not seeing the data that you expect, take a look at your table permissions. Because if I didn't have table permissions to view golf courses, FetchXML won't return anything. So any permissions that you have are applied to FetchXML, so it's important that you are considering that when you're doing it. I'm sure if you counted the number of hours in the world that have been wasted on people thinking their code was wrong when it was really just a case of not having permissions, it would probably be in the millions, would be my guess. So probably what the number one kind of bit of when someone says I'm not seeing what I need, expect to see, it's often because the permissions are not correctly enabled. Okay, so this is great if you want to use Liquid. The other area is the web API. So the web API is still relatively new. The web API is, and what we're talking about here specifically is the Power Pages web API. So the Power Pages web API is an API that you can call using JavaScript on your Power Pages site. I did set one up here. Where was it? Right here. So let's take a look at what I've done in this particular page here. Let me see if I put it in here. Okay, I put it in the custom JavaScript. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the web API. I'm going to focus just on how do we call FetchXML using the web API. So if you haven't used a web API before, this is a pretty kind of standard function that you'll find in a bunch of Microsoft samples about how to get the request verification token. So really, the kind of quote unquote custom code, again, which I've really stolen from Microsoft for the most part, is right here. So this is, we're doing a AJAX request. So this is doing an AJAX request using jQuery AJAX. And we're doing, this is the standard kind of API endpoint. It's /_API/ then the table name. Sorry, not the table name. It's the, what do they call that? The entity data set name or something like that. It's the plural. It's the name with the plural in it anyways. And then again, what I think that many people may not realize is that normally people are putting in, and they're using, because this is generally an OData endpoint, they're doing things like filter or sort by, or those types of things. But I'm not sure how many people realize that you can actually just pass in FetchXML. And then you just have to include your FetchXML query. Now, because it does contain some funny characters in it, you have to do the encode URI on it. But you can see here, I've done a query where I'm getting the top 50 contacts with a first name, or I'm grabbing the first name, I'm getting the condition here. So this here is my entire FetchXML statement. And all I'm doing is I'm coding it, and I'm passing it in as the FetchXML query string parameter on the contacts web API. So if I go to preview this and I check this page and I look at my developer console, what we see here is this happens when the page loads. And then what I do with this as it runs this is I just console log the data. So if I go back over here and look in here, I expect to see the data that web API call returns me, which is exactly what I was asking for. It's an array of contacts where I've just asked for the first name, so I'm getting that back, and it's only the ones that are matching my particular FetchXML query. Looks like even Franco didn't know about this, and if you don't know who Franco is, Franco probably knows most of the stuff better than I do, especially in terms of he is a liquid guru. He's I think it was last month. I think he was with us. He's presented multiple times. So yeah, I really think the FetchXML thing is not well known because it's not documented, but it's not really documented, because if you go to the web API, the documentation here is about just the regular the regular Dataverse API, and there's essentially some links from the Microsoft one where you say perform read operations, and then I think there might be like right here where it says like you can use these, but at no point do they actually call out, hey, you can use FetchXML. So the only reason I discovered it was I was going through some of the templates, and Microsoft was using it in some of the templates, and I was like, oh wow, like that's awesome, because there isn't exactly the same, like you can do things with FetchXML that you can't necessarily do with the traditional OData syntax. So there's just certain like links and stuff like that and expands that. FetchXML is just it's another tool that you can use. So it's relatively simple. If you know FetchXML, you just basically make this web API call, passing the FetchXML query string parameter, and then yeah, like I said, you can quickly inspect the thing that you get back, but the main thing is that you get this values array with all the data that you'd be expecting. Okay, next, let's talk about list custom filters. So go here, I'm going to close that. I'm going to go to my golf courses list. So if I preview this page, what it is it's just a kind of a basic list of the golf courses that, oh, do you know what? It's not a basic list right now. Spoiler alert, I'm working on some of the next tips, which are about the maps functionality. Let me use a different page because I've already got some samples of the custom golf courses. So if you're not already familiar with the filters options on lists, what we have is, so this is kind of the list over here. When you go and you say add filters, you have the ability to add some kind of faceted type filters, or like essentially custom specific filters to the page. So if I preview this page, we've got all of these different filters, and we can do things like there's checkboxes. There's a bunch of different options in here that you can do. If as you're creating the thing, you say add filter, you'll see that the options are you can do a text filter, checkbox, drop down, radio button, or there's this magic custom button. So with this magic custom button, they're going to ask you to provide the FetchXML that represents your query. Now I'm going to, I don't want to type this out while everyone's watching. Go back over here, and I'm just going to kind of copy and paste something in here. So I'm going to paste this in here. So in this case, it is not the entire fetch XML. It is only the filter section. So if I go back to here, you would craft whatever filter you want, but you only grab this. You don't grab the entire fetch XML statement. You grab just the filter section. And the way this works is you can see here, there's actually some custom namespaces, some custom attributes that you include. So this one's called custom filter. So you'll see that I have ADX:UI name. And so we use that to determine what the title is above this. And then we have these conditions. And you can see here, I have a condition where the name is something like Cook, which is the course that I grew up on. And you can also see that I've got this UI name here of Cook. And then I've got another one down here with a attribute where the green fee, where the operator is greater than 75, UI name is green fee. So if I click down on this, the idea with this is that even though I have two conditions in my filter, those conditions will only be included if I check that box. So if I start and I just click apply, everything will, like, it's like those filters don't apply. But if I check this box, then it will include that condition in my filter. And so you can build some relatively complex conditions into your filters. So it allows you to essentially build pretty complex filtering on your list. So now that I have this, we've got a couple of things here. If I click this and click apply, you can see that my filter is based on just that one being selected. Now, yeah, so now here we're seeing that these ones are the green fees, because the green fee for Cook is actually less than $75. So we're seeing that one. If I click both, then we'll see both, because all three are matched, like it's kind of one or the other. And the reason that it's or is because if I go back to my list and I go back to my custom filter, you can see that I put the type of or. You can kind of modify that. You can have subconditions. There's lots of cool stuff you can do with the filter conditions for the FetchXML. So that is the purpose of these custom filters, is to allow you to define additional things. And yeah, just keep in mind that there's a custom attribute here for the UI name, which shows up at the top. The UI name that appears in the conditions is actually something that is a standard property of a condition attribute. So that's why there's no ADX in front of it, because that one already exists. All right, we got one more here, and this is on lists as well, but it also applies to forms. So when we're looking at one of these buttons, if I go and edit my list, we have action buttons. So in this case, we have the ability to view, and I've got the delete button. So the configuration of this advanced functionality is not available in the Power Pages Design Studio. So what we actually have to do is we have to flip over to the Portal Management app. And the idea is that we can supply a FetchXML query that determines the visibility of those buttons. So for example, let's say on the delete button, I only want to allow someone to delete it if the green fee is greater than $75. That doesn't really make sense, but I can do that. So let me show you. So if you go over to the options area, we have our grid configuration. Now I was in here earlier, so I had that turned on. But if you didn't have the advanced settings turned on, you check that box, you'll get a whole bunch of more options, often as labels and tooltips and that sort of thing. But there's also this filter criteria. So I'm going to go to the delete and I'm going to add, and this is where it's different than what we just looked at. I add the entire FetchXML query. So not just the filter condition, the entire FetchXML query. And I'm saying golf course where the green fee is greater than $75. So I'm saving this. I'm going back to my designer and I'm just going to preview this. I'm doing this so I clear the cache, because the cache is not aware that I made those changes directly in the Portal Management app. So now, if I drop this down, I see the delete button, but we'll see if this works. You'll see that the delete button has disappeared for this one. So for every single row in the table, it's going to evaluates that FetchXML function and determines whether or not that one applies. So by putting that filter criteria FetchXML, only rows that would be returned by that query are have the button displayed on them. Now, the same functionality also exists on a form. So if I went into basic forms, because essentially the same, let me just find one here. If we go into, I think it's additional settings, we have the same action button configuration here. So if I added a delete and I said advanced settings, we would have the filter criteria here as well. So whether that button is displayed in a list or whether it's displayed on a form, the same thing applies. By adding the FetchXML, you can have action buttons hidden or shown based on details about the record that it's being shown for. The last little bit I'll just mention here is you will see filter criteria on the download button and the create button, but those are, as far as I know, don't matter, because you can't filter on a record that's not created. And there's the download button. I'm not aware that putting the filter criteria on that does anything either. So I think those are just, they're there because all the other buttons have them, but I don't believe that those have any impact. So they're really more for the item actions, not for the view actions. So those are the places that I know of for sure that we use FetchXML and Power Pages. I would say the vast majority of the time we're seeing it used in Liquid. Building out Liquid templates using FetchXML is, we've got people on our team that's basically what they do for a living. So it's a very popular way to customize the look and feel of Power Pages. Like I said, I think the web API is probably relatively understood. Like not a lot of people would know that exists. And I think in terms of the list custom filters, if you're starting to get into custom filters on your list or on the filter criteria on the action buttons, again, I think those are things that a lot of people may not realize because they're kind of hidden in the advanced settings, but they are super super cool techniques that you might realize that how much you miss them once you realize that they exist. Okay, back to our presentation here. So our next call, July 27th at the normal time, 3 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you to the team, Jason, the team at MS Dynamics World. And I will open the floor to see if there's any questions about today's topic or anything else, Power Pages, portals built with Dataverse, that sort of stuff. If not, we will wrap it up for today. Well, I think, Jason, I think we could probably wrap it up. I'm not seeing any questions.
Yeah, we can do that. Well, thanks as always, Nick. Great job. And thanks for being here. Thanks to everyone in the audience too. We will end the recording here and see you next month, I hope. Have a great day.
Great. Thanks.